this past Sunday, that wonderful passage out of Isaiah 43, where we talked about walking a new path and how you get on that path, and that God will make a path where there appears to be no way, and that's not a hard thing for God. Would you agree with that? It looks tough for us, but it's not a hard thing for God to make a path. There's a path, we need a path, and God can make that path. I bet if you took time to look back over your life, I know it's true in my life, and I won't spend all the time telling about some of those, but you could look back and you could say, hey, here's a time when God made a way. Here's a time when God made a way. And you could start looking at that and say, it's remarkable how many times God made a way when I didn't know if there would be a way. And I certainly didn't know how to make a way. Would that be your testimony? Yeah. I think that's true for all of us. That's why it's okay to look back. It's just not okay to live back there. Right? It's okay to look back, but as Isaiah 43 said, remember not the former things. Not because they're bad, but when he says that, he means don't go live there. I'm doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it? See? So it's good to look back, but it's not good to live back. We talked about the land of nostalgia. How many of you have lived in the land of nostalgia before? The good old days. The good old days were kind of like bad old days if you go back, because our brains trick us. When we get here, we start looking back and think it was so wonderful back there. Oh, it was so great back there. But if you really went back there, you know what you would be thinking? If you were back there, do you know what you'd be thinking? I remember the good old days. That's just the way we're kind of wired, in that our brains have a way of filtering out, unless it's just incredibly traumatic. We forget. It wasn't so great. It was okay. That's the way we are. And that's why we can't live back there. But we can go back there and we can learn and we go forward. Jerry and I were talking before the study began tonight about learning from back then. And by the way, you've heard the old adage, those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And I think that's sometimes true spiritually, because God's trying to teach us lessons, because He's trying to take us somewhere. And if we don't learn the lessons, we can't go forward, because we need what He's trying to teach us for what's ahead for us. Does that make sense? And so we get this one verse points to a story that we'll go look at here, and I want to show you some stuff out of there for the next week or maybe the next 2 weeks. But he says in verse 29, what we read there, that it's the story of the Exodus, right? Where God made a way. God made a path. There was no path. And you remember that story, don't you? Go to Exodus 14. We're going to read and look through this here in a little bit. But I want to ask you, I love to do this. I want to ask you a question. When you think of the Exodus, what do you think of? What do you think of? What? 10 Commandments, okay. Red Sea. What? Miracle. The miracle parting. What else do you think of? When you think of, somebody says the Exodus, the story of the Exodus, what do you think of? Journey? Manna. Somebody said obedience. Obedience. I would add, or lack of obedience. There were both. There was both. What?
I said they were doing a lot of backsliding.
They did plenty of that, including, by the way, this particular incident. And I'm going to tell you something, remind you of something when we get here in about 6 weeks. What else do you think of when you think of the Exodus? What? Moses, okay. Disbelief. What? Passover. Deliverance. Pharaoh. We'll read about him in a minute. In the back, John? What? Passover. Okay. Anything else when you think about the Exodus? 40 years. I'll tell you a good one I think of. Cecil B. DeMille. No. You know, y'all laugh at that, but there's a generation today, if I said that, they go. Charlton Heston. Okay. Okay. The plagues. Idolatry. Slow learners. Hey, they're a lot like us, weren't they? Jerry and I was talking about, I shared a passage where Paul writes in the New Testament, and he's talking about the Old Testament, and he said, these things were written as an example or for your instruction. Why? Because I want to tell you something. I think a lot of the reason God gave us so many Israelite stories in the Old Testament is because they are us. We can see ourselves in that. You know, we get to look. You know, I think about sometimes the disciples, Peter and all. We see their flaws and their mistakes and everything. But if we're honest, we can probably identify with a whole lot of it. You know. Now, we have the luxury of looking back and acting spiritual. Does that make sense? We can look back. I can look back and go, yeah, here's what they did, and this and this and this, as if I would have been above it. I'm not sure that we would have. Hello? I mean, especially a Baptist church. We got to vote on that, Moses. You know. So we have the privilege of looking back. It's the same thing you do with a child, right? You want a child to learn off of your nickel, don't you? You don't want your child to do some of the stupid things that you did. Anybody in here do stupid things? And I think we had 5 people raise their hands. The rest of you are liars, which means you just did something stupid. But we all do, don't we? We all do. Do you have any of those things in your past where the devil will try to throw it up at you and you cringe? You ever do that and you just cringe and think, oh, God, how could I? You ever do that and think, God? And by the way, what? Daily. And the devil try to throw that up at you. Why? Do you know why he does that? The Bible says he is the accuser of the brethren. Here's what he's really doing, saying, yeah, you blew that one. You really think God forgave you? You know? Well, okay, I better stay tight here. Anything else that you think of when you think of the Exodus? What? Grumbling. Somebody said the fire and the cloud, right? Tabernacle. What? Well, he did in their journey, water from the rock. All right. Anything else? I mean, you can see there's just a lot, isn't there? The bush, God speaking. The rules of the sacrifices. The sacrifices, the atonement, the atoning acts. the rules, right? There's a lot, isn't there, when you start thinking about the Exodus? What do you think about? What do you think about? So we can learn a lot from the Exodus. We can still learn a lot from the Exodus. And I want us to look at this story a bit tonight and talk about that. I started to begin in verse 8 of chapter 14, but I'm going to start at the beginning. And so follow along with me, and we'll stop along the way here. This is the story. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth. That place. And then Migdol, and the sea in front of Baal-zephon. And you shall encamp facing it by the sea. Okay, this is where you're to go, by the sea. So they're going to encamp in this area right by the Red Sea. For Pharaoh, and now God is telling Moses, here's what's going to happen. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. God says, so you go camp them by the Red Sea, because Pharaoh's going to see them camping and think, uh-oh, they've got no place to go. They've shut down. They're trapped. All right? Verse 4. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh. This is an important statement because we see it a couple of times here in this story. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all of his host. That means his army. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. So they went to, that is, they went to this encampment, okay? And so that's when he says, and they did so, they went to this camp. But look at, he tells Moses, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to harden his heart. Why? Because I'm going to show Pharaoh who's the real boss. Now you have to understand something. In the time that this happened, there was no empire greater than Egypt. There was no empire comparable to Egypt. So, and by the way, the pharaohs were frequently worshipped as deities. They were considered gods. That's why their tombs were so elaborate that they built pyramids and those sorts of. They were so elaborate because the pharaohs were considered or worshipped often like gods were. And of course, they had many gods, as you know, but pharaohs were often worshipped. So here's what I believe was happening. God's saying, I'm going to show him who the real God is. That he's not as powerful as he thinks he is, that there is someone greater than him. And so he says, I'm going to get glory over Pharaoh and all his host or his army. Okay. So when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, just like God said. And by the way, just like they did with each of the plagues. Remember, the plagues would come and Pharaoh would say, okay, and then he'd change his mind. All right, so his mind was changed toward the people, and they said, what is this we have that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? All of a sudden, Pharaoh and the people go, what were we thinking? See, they had forgotten the plagues. Israel had forgotten that God had delivered them by a mighty hand, but so had Pharaoh and them. And so they kind of think like, what were we thinking? We let these people, we want these people, we want them serving us, because if they're not there, guess what? We gotta take over. And so it's like they think they've come to their senses. But this is a work of God. Right? Because God is going to harden Pharaoh's heart to make him cause him to think, wait a minute, I don't know why I let these people go. Now, by the way, there's a little lesson there for us to remind us that sometimes God is working in things behind the scenes or out there that you don't even realize. God was up to all of this. The people They didn't understand. Moses was told what was going on, but the people by and large didn't understand. Well, I wouldn't say by and large. I'd say they didn't understand at all what was going on. And it reminded me of something. It reminds me in the New Testament. Do you know when Jesus was crucified, the devil thought he won? The devil thought he won. And that's why the devil was so involved in the death. But what he didn't know is that God was actually orchestrating all of this. That's why Jesus in the garden prays and says, if there's any other way, Father, that this can pass, let's take another way. Why? Because Jesus knew that God was in control. People, I want to tell you in your life, God is always in control. You just may not realize that God is operating in things that you wouldn't ever imagine. So the devil thinks that crucifixion, that's where the victory will come. And we will beat him on the cross. You know what Paul writes in Corinthians? He writes and says this, if the devil had have known, he would have never allowed for the crucifixion, or he would have tried to stop the crucifixion. Now there's another lesson, by the way. God knows everything that's going on. You and I see in part right now, the Scripture says. One day we'll know in full, but right now we see through a glass dimly. We don't understand it all. But it also is a reminder that the devil doesn't know everything. And sometimes people treat the devil like he knows everything that God knows. He knows some stuff. By the way, he knows his time is short. The Bible teaches us in Revelation, and that's why in the tribulation time he will unleash his wrath. He can only do it because God has allowed it, but he will he will unleash his wrath on the believers, but God will unleash his wrath on Satan. But it says in Revelation that the devil knows that his time is short. See, he knows that his time is short. There are some things he knows. Do you know the devil and the demons, they all believe that Jesus is who he said. They know that. Even the pigs knew it. We were talking about pigs earlier. The pigs knew it. Why? How do we know the pigs knew who he was? Because the demons spoke through them and said, have you come here to destroy us? And then they went over the ledge and down the ravine and into the water and drowned. And by the way, you would have thought, he cast the demon into the pigs, and the demon spoke from the pig. You get it, you know. And then the pigs committed suicide. That just came to me. That's pretty good, don't y'all think? That's pretty good, yeah. I like that. I'll use that again sometime. One of my favorite cartoons, I have it as a picture somewhere in my archives. It's about this big. It's actually a poster. There was a cartoonist named Gary Larson, and he did some of the most hilarious cartoons. And he does one of the pigs going over the cliff, and they're racing down toward the water, and their head is down, and they're headed toward the water. And then there's this one pig out of the whole. Are pigs a herd? Is that what we call a pig? Pigs, a herd? They're kind of like cats. And in this poster, these pigs are racing. They're, just the picture's full of pigs. They're racing down. There's this one pig, though. And it's like he knows the camera's taking a picture, and he's looking over to the side with his eyes big. And then you look on, he's got a life jacket on. Okay, let me get back. We've almost lost it here tonight, but let me get back. My point is there are some things that the demons know. They know who Jesus is. James says in James that the demons believe and tremble. Now, they're not saved. It's not saving belief. It's this kind of belief. They know who he is, but they're not saved. Okay. The devil knows that his time is limited on this earth. The devil knows that his control is restricted to what God allows. How do we know that, class? Because there's a conversation that happens at the beginning of the book of Job. You remember that? And God says, have you seen my servant Job? And the devil says, well, he worships you and follows you because you've made his life so easy. But you take that, so you let me touch him, and he will curse you. The devil had to get permission, didn't he? Did you know Jesus told Peter, he said, the devil has sought to sift you like wheat, but I've prayed for you. And he says, and this is a remarkable statement, and when you are restored, go and strengthen your brothers. Isn't that that's pretty, Jesus is telling him, look, I know, I've prayed for you. You're going to get through this. You're going to make it. But what does all of that point to? It points to the fact that God is in control. And by the way, that's true of your life. It's not just true of Israel in the wilderness. Though we sometimes, somebody said grumble, we grumble because we forget that, don't we? Or we forget the mighty things that God has done for us. Your life is full of mighty things that God has done for you. It's full of them. And we forget the mighty things that he has done for us. And you know what? When we forget those things, when we come upon hardship, what do? No, it's not fair. It's not right. You know. But God is in control. And God causes all things to work together for good to those who are called, right? According to his purposes. See? Well, y'all didn't know that was all in there, did you? Okay, so God is going to show Pharaoh that he's in control. Pharaoh's not in control. Pharaoh just thinks he's in control. The Bible says it is God who lifts up one and casts down another. The lot is cast, the Scripture says, but the outcome is determined by the Lord. So, let's move on. Verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told the people had fled, the mind of the Pharaoh, well, I just read that. We had changed toward the people, and so they said, what have we done? Let's go get them, essentially. Verse 6. So he made ready his chariot, and he took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots, and all of the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And here it is, and the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel, while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. Now, what does that mean? Boldness. They were rejoicing. We're out of there, and by the way, they took a lot of plunder with them. Right? They took wealth with them. And so they're going out, they're having a kind of a celebration journey out. All right? They're defying their former captors. All right? So, verse 9, the Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his horsemen and his army, and overtook them encamped at the sea by that place. I'm not even going to try. In front of Baal-zephon. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes. And now here's where the thing starts changing a little bit. The people lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly, and the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. Now, it's an interesting thing. Let me for a second jump back to Hebrews. Hebrews 11, where we are, is about people of faith, right? I mean, you don't get in that chapter if you have not exercised some great faith in God. Would you agree with that statement? That's how you get in there. They're there. Now, this gives us hope, and this is why I tell you this. But we see them right here, and they cried out to the Lord. And the next verse says, look at verse 11, they said to Moses, "It is because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness. What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt?" What is that, class? It was something they had the spiritual gift of grumbling. Have y'all ever seen somebody like that? It's like they had the spiritual gift of grumbling. And maybe that's you. Y'all look straight ahead. Ladies, don't look at your husbands. But here we see, now, until I study, I've taught Hebrews many times through the years. I've taught this passage many times, but it never, and I've always noticed the grumbling. And by the way, if we were to go on through the book of Exodus, that's a consistent characteristic of the Israelites, which is why I think they're Baptist. But I want to tell you this. I don't think I'd ever thought about it in connection with Hebrews 11. Now, it doesn't say they grumbled in Hebrews 11. It just said by faith. But I began, as I was studying again for our time here in the last several weeks, I thought, you know what? These grumbling Israelites made it into God's hall of fame of faith. Now, friend, I want to tell you something. If they can make it in, there's hope for us. Right? Because you and I have a tendency, as I said, we look back at the story of the Exodus and we go, how did they not get it? Remember, this is after the plagues. They had seen plagues that did not affect them, but affected the Egyptians. Look what God has done. Wow, God is on our side. God is for us. God is for us. And in short order, they forgot all of that. So here they are, and they're belly aching now to, first they cry, God, help. And then they turn to Moses. Moses, this is your fault. This is you. This is a scheme. You brought us out here to kill us. You made a deal with the Egyptians. By the way, didn't you used to be a part of the royal family? This is a conspiracy. You've conspired. You brought us out because y'all don't have enough graves in Egypt. So you're just going to kill us here, and we'll be away from Egypt so the massacre won't look as bad. They've forgotten everything. They've forgotten what God had said. They'd forgotten everything they'd taken. Now, they're grumbling. And yet, people, listen, they're in the Hall of Fame of faith. So I thought about that. I thought, God, that's good news for me. Because too many times I've said, God, what are you doing? God, do you know what you're up to? I hadn't said it out loud, but I thought it. God, can I trust you, God? I don't see a way, Lord. I don't see a path. And so I have in my life grumbled at him. What are you doing, God? Why did you take me here? Right? And so it gives us hope. God is such a patient, loving, kind God, isn't he? I mean, I think maybe at this point in the journey, I might have said, later on, God does say, I'm going to kill them. Do you know why? Because of their grumbling. If you keep reading the story of their departure, later on, Moses and him are having a conversation. You remember the Bible says that God talked to Moses like a friend talks to a friend. And they're having a conversation. And you remember, Moses says, God, don't kill them. He didn't say they didn't deserve to be killed. But he said, what will your enemies think if you kill them? If you kill your own people, what will they think? And they had this, but because God said, I'm going to kill them. But right here, God is still, well, he treats them in grace the whole time, to be honest. But right here, they're grumbling because they've been led to the Red Sea, and I don't know. How about you? If you're God and you've done all these mighty acts and they've already forgotten them, how would you have handled it? I'm afraid I would have said, so be it then. Die here in the desert. No skin off my back. You know? But he still is treating them in grace, and they make it into the Hall of Fame of Faith. Now, for this incident, not for everything they did, but for this incident, because at a certain point in time, they had to listen and obey. Let me show you just a couple things right here. We've still got a good time. Notice what happened. Verse 10, go back there. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes. Folks, that it reminds us that we walk by faith and not by sight. Sight said there's no way. All right? Faith walks by. But what did they have here? Well, I just jotted down this. Number one, they had fear of the world. They were afraid. The world was coming after them. Egypt was coming after them. They lifted up their eyes. They saw, remember they've been celebrating, going out defiantly, boldly. They were going out. And all of a sudden, somebody says, look, Pharaoh and the army are coming after us. And they lifted up their eyes. It is a reminder to us that our eyes oftentimes get us in trouble with God. And it's hard not to, isn't it? Isn't it hard not to sometimes become so dependent on what you, especially in a time of trouble? Our senses kick in. Our faith is often minimized because of the magnitude of the trouble. And I really do believe that's why we are told that we walk by faith and not by sight, because if you depend purely on what you see, you're going to get depressed out of your head sometimes. You're going to just think, you're going to say, well, I don't know, there's nothing we can do. And so what God, by the way, God's going to teach both Pharaoh something and Israel something. Jump on ahead to verse 31. Let me just go ahead and show it to you. This is after the fact. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord. And they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So we just fast forward a long way. Don't get too excited about that. But I wanted you to see God was sending a message to Pharaoh and to his people. Pharaoh, you're not who you think you are. And people, I'm more than you think I am. Is the message he's sending. So they had this fear of the world, and I don't think anything's changed about that in 6,000 years. We're so often intimidated by the world. They were afraid of the world. And that's because they live by their eyes. And God was already trying to teach them how to believe in him, how to put their faith in him. And then look on, okay, verse 11. They said to Moses, because there are no graves in Egypt. Here's the second thing, if you're taking notes, to write down. Forgotten promises. They had forgotten the promises that God had given to them. That he was going to deliver them. that He was going to take them out. They had been praying and crying out to God for 400 years for this very thing to happen. And then Moses told them that God had delivered them from their enemy with a mighty hand. Before they even went out of Egypt, God has done this. And God has delivered you. The promise of God. Moses delivers it to them. But by their trouble caused them to forget the promises of God. If you live by your sight, you'll forget the power of God. And if you put your eyes on the difficulties and the troubles, and there are always going to be those, you'll forget the promises of God. Does that make sense? And they forgot what God had promised them, all right? And then look on down to verse 12. Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Now they're talking back to Moses. Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, all right? What's number 3? It is false security. The Egyptians weren't so bad. If you just left us alone, we would still be there making bricks without straw. We would still be in bondage. We would still be slaves. If you'd have just left well enough alone, Moses, what were they saying? For 400 years they'd said, God deliver us, and now they're saying, we were pretty secure where we were. I think we would rather go back to Egypt. We'd rather go back. Isn't that the way our flesh is sometimes? Instead of going forward by faith, our flesh says go back to what feels comfortable or secure. And so their trouble caused them to change their perspective, and they began to say, you know what, to come think of it, I don't think making bricks for 16 hours a day, that wasn't such a bad job. And it wasn't so bad when he took the straw away. It's just, I didn't mind getting beat with whips. That wasn't bad. Come think of it. That's what your flesh will do. It'll say back there, the land of nostalgia. That's what they're saying. Take us back, Moses. Oh, we remember the good old days. What were the good old days? When we were slaves. When we got up every day and everything we did, mundane, repeated, every day we did, it was all for Pharaoh. We barely had enough to feed our families. We were beaten if we didn't do everything or didn't meet our quotas or everything. Oh, what a grand time that was. That's what they're saying. Be careful, because you can sing the same song. Oh, Lord. I remember back then.
Brother Ray, let me ask you a question. When Joseph was there, it wasn't 70 people that came over at one time, was it? 400 years later, there was about 1 million people, wasn't it?
When Joseph was there, the number was very small in Egypt. But here's what happened. After Joseph, is when they went into bondage, okay? And what gave Egypt leverage is because of the famine that had starved, and so all the nations started coming to Egypt because Egypt had an abundance. Why did they have an abundance? Because of Joseph. If you read that story, then you will hear it says, and there arose a generation that knew not Joseph. See, God, as long as Joseph was alive, there was only a handful that came to Joseph. But here's what happened. But Joseph sent back his bones would be returned to Israel. But Joseph sent back food for those who were in Israel that were starving, particularly his family. But when Joseph died, everybody was dependent on Egypt. And we don't know whether this is true or not, but they may have made themselves indentured slaves to survive. Does that make sense? At least we can, this almost the same kind of logic that's going on right here. At least if we go over there, we can, and so that's how you get to, by this time, which is several generations later, you get to 1 million people coming out of Egypt. All right? They were fruitful and multiplied. But there were a whole bunch more in the land in that sense. So here, and I'll stop there because our time's gone. I have some more I want to show you in this story. We'll come back to it. But they had this false sense of security. So the three things to get from these people of faith, never forget that we started in Hebrews 11:29 with the children of Israel who by faith crossed the Red Sea. Now we're going to talk more about that in the week to come. But here's what you take away. They responded with fear at the world because they were living by their sight. They forgot the promises of God because they were living by sight. And because they were living by sight, they had a false sense of security about Egypt. We can go back there, and that's secure. Does that make sense? All three of those things still happen to us today. All three of them. All right? Any comments or questions before we go? Anybody here tonight and you're not sure if you died, you'd go to heaven, you'd like to put your trust in Christ? Anybody here? Anybody here that says, I know Christ, but I'd like to become a member of the family here at Ridgecrest? Anybody? Okay. Glad you've been here again tonight. I thought we already got you guys. The Skeens, Jeff and Valerie Skeen, coming to join. They've been threatening me. I mean, they've been mentioning it to me for several weeks. Have moved up here from Destin. Am I? Okay, never mind. But know the Lord and are here to become a part of our family. Welcome the Skeens. Would you do that? Thank you. We'll get some information on you guys. And by the way, both of them have already put a blue ball in. That's pretty good, isn't it? So, you that are dragging your feet. All right. On your way out tonight, the bucket's over there. If you've got an extra $1 or $2 and you want to throw that in, we'll use it for benevolence. This Sunday is kind of a partner message to last Sunday. Last Sunday, I said, walk a new path. This Sunday's message, and I told you I had to pray and ask the Lord which. This Sunday's message is walk in a new power. Walk in a new power. And so I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. Y'all have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you Sunday. God bless you. You're dismissed.